I had questions about Safiyetic. There were just some things that really stood out. The depressive nature of the inscriptions themselves, for one. I mean, he mentions that in one of his lectures
Mm,
that they seem to be very like, oh, I'm longing for this. I want this. I miss this person. I want them to be secure. Or can, God
hmm.
keep them secure? Can we get rain? Can this dude's raid be successful? I just found that aspect extremely interesting. It was reoccurring throughout the
Yeah.
book.
And the very
Yeah.
fatalistic view of life as well. This idea that fate is
Yes. Yes.
uncontrollable and it's complete, even fate is uncontrollable by the gods. It's just this sort of like brute force that everyone is subject to.
So there's an interesting body of research that connects to all of this, right? This really reminds me of something that I've looked at, and this is not, this is way beyond my area of speciality here. This is just me reading a lot of things that other scholars have said about this, other specialists and other sort of summaries of the relevant material. So I should just add that as a caveat, right? But there's this really interesting body of research to do with Arabia in like over the last like 200 years or 300 years, right? Like Arabian, like religion and society and culture and practice in like especially among Bedouins, among sort of nomadic tribal populations in Arabia, in especially like the 1800s, but there are also more recent studies as well, right?
Yeah,
And so
during
some of
like
the sort of names yeah, go ahead.
yeah, during the Wahhabi ascendancy, before and after.
Yes, it's sort of it sort of coincides with that. So the sort of names I'm thinking of here connected to this are, for example, like Claude Conder, Joseph Henninger, Clinton Bailey, Patricia Kroner. These are some of the authors who have variously talked about this or summarized this research, right? And the research, so a lot of the research was to do with like Bedouins in and around sort of modern day Jordan, for example, right, in the late 1800s. And so some of these sort of European travel writers and, traveling scholars and so on who sort of lived amongst or traveled amongst or interacted with these populations, they talk about their religion, right, and their religiosity. Now, broadly, of course, they are Muslim, right? They identify as Muslim and they worship God, right? Or they believe in God, right? And they observe to some degree, right? Like some of them observe Ramadan, for example, but they don't pray the daily prayers. They don't have mosques. They don't have imams. They venerate the graves of ancestors. They venerate sacred stones and trees, right? And also, even more recently, for example, the study, this is a Bailey's study of Bedouin religious practices in Sinai and the Negev, right? And that's from like 1982, right? So like very like quite recently. And what does he say about the sort of religiosity there of the the local Bedouin population, right? Well, they observe the Eid celebrations, right? They circumcise male infants. They observe the four-wife limit, and they often observe Ramadan, right? So that's that's fairly orthoprax, right? But they pray sporadically and incorrectly, right, by the standards of the ulama, of the cities, and they don't visit mosques, they don't consult ulama, and they make propitiatory sacrifices to God. They make propitiatory sacrifices to dead saints and ancestors at their graves and at shrines. They observe various taboos and they practice magic and divination. And in general, in all of these kinds of studies, right, going back to the 1800s, for example, another really interesting recurring feature of Bedouin life is they have their own tribal law, which they prefer to the fiqh and the sharia of the Quran, of hadith, of the urban ulama. They actually just have their own tribal law, right? And they just reject when it conflicts. In many cases, they'll just reject, the sharia or fiqh to the degree that they even know it, right? So they what they really follow is their own sort of tribal law. And so what this is the interesting point about all of this, right? Because that, what's the broader point here? How does this relate to what you were talking about with the sort of Safavidic inscriptions and so on? What's the connection? So the interesting connection here is the environment and the lifestyle have an effect on the religion and the culture, right? So the way that that's manifesting here is like these, at least in the pre-modern period, right? Obviously now with modern technology and infrastructure and so on and so forth, things are changing. But up until fairly recently, think about, the environment is one where there's very little water, right? And so there's very little sort of arable land, right? Already then this is sort of the something that sort of selects for this sort of nomadic lifestyle and population and so on and so forth, right? That's quite obvious, right? Like you have to move around more and have sort of these sort of, it's more of like selects for pastoralism, right? With sort of like camels and goats and other kinds of animals that you can, that the lesser amounts of water and foliage can still sustain, right? Whereas you can't really sort of like, raise cattle and have farms and so on in that sort of very arid environment, right, across a lot of Arabia, right? So that's obvious. Okay, that's obviously the preconditions for sort of nomadic pastoralism and so on.
And just to add,
but there's more to it, right?
Enough water to make
Yeah.
wudu, in many instances throughout your day.
Sure, there is another sort of direct connection between environment and practice, for example. But what this sort of situation also means is that there's no, these people are living without a state, right? This is a stateless society. This is a society without like institutions of learning in any sort of formal way that involves like, libraries and buildings and books. You see what I'm saying? Like it's very hard to maintain all of that in this kind of environment, in this kind of society, right? So they don't, like, it's very hard to have ulama in the traditional sense, right? So already the effect of the environment and the lifestyle already sort of selects for kind of lax orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right? Because it's very hard for the like urban ulama, for their sort of ideals to have an effect on these kinds of people. You see what I'm saying? Because they just don't really have the infrastructure for it, right? So already there's something, there's a mechanism here that is going to make it hard for orthodoxy and orthopraxy to be enforced, i.e. coming out of the, from the custodians, the ulama, the custodians of orthodoxy and orthopraxy in the cities, in the sedentary, settled, developed areas, out to the periphery, right? And obviously what I'm describing is going to apply to some degree to the countryside as well. You see sort of analogous stuff, but we're focusing here specifically on the sort of much more arid regions where we have these sort of nomadic pastoralist populations. Okay, so that's one thing already, right? But you also, the lack of a state has a big effect here. Because if we don't have a state, right, then you need social problem solvers who can fulfill similar functions of like dispute resolution, for example, right? Absent state infrastructure, the offices of the law and so on and so forth. And in a situation like that, where you need social problem solvers, if the problem solvers are in some way supernaturally connected, right? They can receive inspiration from spirits, for example. That's going to kind of confer more authority and more neutrality to them, right? Like if the judgments are coming from spirit, I mean, that's much more objective than if it's just my opinion, right? So there's some, already we can sort of see there like an interesting sort of functional role that's being fulfilled by all of these sort of soothsayers, right? So the kinds of soothsayers that are described in, pre-Islamic Arabia, you basically find the same kinds of people still kicking on in Arabia in the 1800s. They're still there. fulfilling very similar functions, performing in similar ways, being inspired by spirits, producing the sort of the sort of rhymed prose. You know, it's the same. And the reason for that is obvious, because in the absence of a state, these kinds of people in this kind of role fulfill like a vital sort of social function. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, the fact that sort of soothsaying is like very, very harshly condemned in hadith, right? For example, canonical hadith is all, you know, kufr and all kinds of other things, irrelevant, because they need they need these people clearly, right? They obviously play an important social role. So not only are they there in pre-Islamic Arabia, they remain all the way through for more than 1,000 years. They just, you know, right there, very close to the, you know, the heartlands of Islam, so to speak, you know, Makkah, Medina, very close by. These sort of, you know, we might call them like a pagan remnant. I wonder if pagan is because they're Muslim, right? So maybe pagan is, you know, but they're this thing that's associated with pre-Islamic paganism, this institution, this role, these people that are right there, you know, more than 1,000 years later, right? Up until at least like 200 years ago, they're still there with the same sorts of roles, with the same kinds of practices, you know, very similar. Once again, the kind of environment and the lifestyle is sort of having an effect here on the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy. Does that sort of make sense? Is that making sense thus far?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so the way that this connects back to what you were talking about is because of this environment, right? And because of this lifestyle, because of the lack of infrastructure, these populations are way more vulnerable to suffering and death than other populations. They're way more vulnerable to the elements and to animals, to snake bite, to scorpion sting, right? To predators. You know, it's much more so than people living in houses in a village, a settled area. You see what I'm saying? It's just, you know, that environment is much less likely to be, you know, to have to deal as much with, you know, wild animal predators and things like that, right? Than people in just like a kind of a more wilderness environment. You see what I'm saying?
So people who are living in a wilderness
you know,
environment are probably looking for more control over the elements than someone in an urban area because of what they're exposed to.
Exactly. They are way more on the edge, right? They have way less control over the environment. And so what that selects for is beliefs and rituals that confer more control or a greater sense of control over the environment, right? Or a much stronger desire to have control over the environment is going to sort of select for beliefs and practices that seem to confer that kind of control, right? And so, you know, all of these sort of quote unquote pagan, you know, practices and beliefs that you find among them, right? All these sort of propitiatory sacrifices, where they're kind of like making deals with God, right? Or through these sort of saints, through these ancestors and so on. All of these are kind of like techniques for ameliorating their situation, you know, methods of trying to sort of control the chaos, you know, and carnage of the natural world, if that makes sense, right? So there's a direct connection there. And so the way that bring this all the way back around to the inscriptions, to the fatalism, and to how, you know, depressed they seem, right? You can directly see the connection, because these are people who are dealing with, you know, an unbelievably sort of dicey kind of lifestyle, right? Where you could just like death is a far more ever present in their lives than in other places, right? So you can see why you have this sort of fatalism, right? Because the environment is just so much more deadly. You're just so much more likely to just suddenly die, and, you know, obviously you don't have access to doctors and medicine, or, you know, anywhere near the same degree that you would if you're in a more sedentary or developed region, for example, right? And so there's a direct connection, I think, between the environment and the lifestyle on the one hand, and this sort of culture and the religion on the other, including both, for example, all the things we just described, how they've been often so, by the standards of the urban ulama, they're so heterodox, right? And and have all these like wrong practices and so on the one hand, and also the sort of the fatalism and so on that you're describing from the inscriptions on the other. You can sort of see a clear link between all of that, if that makes sense.
So basically, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab wasn't entirely wrong in his observations of what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula during his time, because a lot of what you said I came across just reading academic histories on the founding of Saudi Arabia, starting from its pre-Wahhabi time, during its Wahhabi time, and after, or I guess people would probably consider the Wahhabi time to still be rolling. But I was shocked when I had read quotes from travel writers who were going through Arabia at the time, pre-Wahhabi and during its ascendancy, and how, people close to the heartland of Islam, or where Islam was founded or rose up out of, were still having certain practices that mirrored what was going on pre-Islamic times, or what the Quran came to combat via the mission of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So, I found all of that very interesting, that all the way up into the 1800s, these kind of practices persist. I would have thought that, hey, Islam came, spread to everywhere, everybody's praying the 5 prayers, fasting during Ramadan, and has a clear understanding of what it means to be a Muslim, and normative Islam is something that is understood, but that definitely doesn't seem to be the case in pre-modern times.
So interestingly, there are several academics who've explicitly basically said this, that in some respects, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was right. I think Gerald Horting says this, and also Patricia Kroner. And so he was right on 2 counts, right? This is the idea, right? I'm not a specialist in, again, all the caveats. I'm not a specialist in Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, so la adri. But this is what scholars have said, right? So on the one hand, what Ibn Abdul Wahhab is saying is, if you look at the Quran, they aren't the mushrikun who are contemporaneous to the Prophet aren't polytheists or idolaters in the traditional sense, right? They believe in the one God, the sort of the biblical God, the God of Moses, the God of Abraham. And they just, primarily the problem is that they have too high of a view of like intercessory beings, for example, right? And this is something that has also been, scholars like Kroner and Horting argue for as well. That if you look at the Quran, they aren't polytheists or idolaters in the in the usual sense. Clearly, they're monotheists. They're biblical monotheists of some kind, right? They just have wrong, as Kroner points out, they also have like wrong rituals, right? The Quran doesn't like some of like the harvest related rituals and so on, right? But they aren't, they just don't come across as like, polytheists and idolaters in like the Greco-Roman sense, for example, or what you would find with Hinduism, where there's this pantheon of gods, right? And you worship them all, and they have their own temples and they have their own idols that's not what's going on. The mushrikun in the Quran are biblical influenced monotheists who recognize the sort of the God of Moses and Abraham and so on, who also believe in the sort of intercessories and angels or angelic beings, which is quite common in biblical monotheistic cultures and contexts, right? This is so they're not sort of pagans or polytheists in the sense that, like, I don't know, the ancient Nabateans were or something, right? Which is what hadith are depicting. That's what they're depicting is it's like that. But that's not what we find in the Quran, and it's also not what we're finding increasingly in inscriptions, in the inscriptional evidence, right? All the sort of those old sort of pagan gods, disappear in the centuries leading up to the rise of Islam, and instead what we find is monotheism, right?
Of a biblical.
And so, yeah, especially of the biblical variety. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is then what you find in like the 1800s with, the sort of thing that Ibn Abdul Wahhab is sort of criticizing is actually then pretty similar to what we see then in that sort of immediate lead up to the rise of Islam. All of these sort of, speaking specifically about the Bedouins here that we were talking about, but like they are monotheistic. They believe in one God. They call themselves Muslim, right? They don't have, as far as I'm aware, certainly not what I was reading, they don't have like a pantheon of gods, right? They're not pagan in that sense. You know what I mean? Like, again, in that sort of classical sense. They don't have a pantheon of gods who they work, except there's one God, right? But they do have a belief in various kinds of intercessory forces and powers and spirits and things like that, right? They are trying to interact with, for example, these sort of propitiatory sacrifices, right? And so there is a kind of similarity there. And so in that sense, I think people like Kroner, for example, I think explicitly said that, yeah, he was, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was right. So, yeah, again, this is not my area of speciality. I'm just sort of summarizing the relevant literature here, but it's very interesting.
No, it is definitely very interesting, and especially if you open or widen the context, or you make the context wider than Ibn Abdul Wahhab. If you look at Uthman Dan Fodio, Shawkani, Shah Deli Waliullah, if I said his name correctly, but all of these people were contemporary to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and were also trying to combat similar things going on in the regions they came from. So it just makes me wonder, like, this whole idea of normative Islam all the way up until the 18th and 19th century really didn't exist, and that, you saw variations of practice and understanding. Of course, they still identified as Muslim, Allah being the supreme God, but then they also have practices that kind of delegated power to other individuals and other rituals and practices that could be deemed un-Islamic if you look at what Islam came to combat in a pre-Islamic context. So yeah, all of what you said is very interesting, and I would like to see more research. I'm pretty sure there's research out there, and I'm just not aware of it. But I would like to come across more research talking about these things, not just with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, but what was going on with Shawkani and his region, with the people he was around and their understanding of Islam. Same thing with Shah Waliullah. Same thing with Uthman Dan Fodio. Which we know for West African Muslims, even today, they have certain practices that would be deemed un-Islamic, but, are practiced in the society and people have no problem. I seen something with a French boxer or combat fighter who went to a West African country, and he got a blessing. This guy was clearly a Muslim. He was dressed in Muslim garb, made Islamic references, but also gave this guy a spell to help him win in his upcoming fight. And that just totally blew my mind to see something like that in West Africa in, the 20th century, 21st century.
There are famous examples like that. Like there are sorcerers in all kinds of sorcerers in West Africa, for example, like in Muslim West Africa, and you find that all across. If you look all across like pre-modern Muslim societies, right, and still lingering in many places now, magic is everywhere. Sorcery is everywhere. Astrology, divination is everywhere, right? It's really ubiquitous. And not only that, all kinds of other things like the urban ulama are always, they're constantly pulling their hair out at the masses, right? And people in the countryside, and just like all of the lack of orthodoxy and the lack of orthopraxy, right? Like the, lingering Christian rituals and all kinds of things, right? It's like a classic thing that so this sort of illustrates the point, right? That, beyond this sort of the theory and the ideals of, the urban ulama and maybe to some degree more broadly sort of urban populations, there's all kinds of religious diversity going on from region to region, and especially in like the deep countryside, especially out in the sort of area, like what we were talking about, these areas with these sort of nomadic pastoralist populations as well. You can find all kinds of interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's true. It is really interesting. And then modernity came and the spread of a more normative Islam. Modernity, not just modernity, but a combination of things came along, and a more normative understanding of Islam is spreading further and further, or becoming more common.
Right.
Which I much
this now ties in with our previous little discussion that we had about the rise of modern infrastructure and the effect that has on orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So it all comes full circle.